Canon Rumors posted an article the other day about the prospect of an EF-RF hybrid mirrorless camera. Now currently you can use both EF and RF on the current RF cameras just by using an adapter. But the concept behind this particular camera is that it doesn't require the use of an additional adapter. It could take RF and EF mount lenses natively. And a lot of the general comments are people saying how wonderful an idea this is going to be, that people who were heavily invested in the EF lenses back with the DSLRs that want to transition into mirrorless but don't want to reinvest and have to buy a load of RF lenses but don't like using an adapter will be able to get it all in the one camera body. And it is great in principle. However, the practicality of it, there's a couple of potential solutions and workarounds, but there's a lot of physical limitations that I don't see how Canon are going to get around, at least without making the camera extremely complicated and or extremely expensive. The first obvious hurdle is the flange distance conundrum. The lenses have to be mounted the correct distance away from the sensor in order to work. With the Canon DSLRs, the flange distance is 44mm, whereas with the RF lenses, it's only 20mm, which means the two different lens systems would have to be mounted at different distances from the sensor. How are they going to get around this? Well, there's three possible options that I can see. Two involving a movable lens mount and one involving a movable sensor. But all are fundamentally flawed. The first, and what seems most likely, is that the camera body will be natively like an RF lens with the short flange distance, but the mounting plate is almost on an extendable bellow that allows it to be moved out to the 44mm needed when you want to mount the EF lenses. But how structurally sound is that going to be? I mean, you can feel a bit of flex when you start mounting macro tubes onto these setups, and they're rigid tubes. A bellow idea would have to be flexible. You start putting big heavy lenses on there, that is a lot of strain being put onto that system, and I can see it snapping quite easily. The other possibility is rather than extending the lens mount out, you retract it in. So the camera is designed more like a DSLR with the native 44mm flange distance, but then the lens mount can retract into the camera body to the correct 20mm when you're wanting to mount the RF lenses. Except the pitfall with that then means that the back 24mm of the lens is having to retract into the camera body as well. Pretty much all the RF lenses, the barrel of the lens is actually wider than the lens mounting plate. So you have the mounting plate and then immediately the lens comes outwards. So if it was just the mounting plate moving in, the lens wouldn't then fit into the camera. You'd have to have a much bigger opening in order to fit the lenses in. And even then, some of the bigger lenses like the 70-200, the front would have to be huge. The third possibility is you don't move the lens mount, but simply just move the sensor forwards and backwards. The body would naturally be the size of a DSLR, with the sensor positioned way back at 44mm for the EF lenses, and then when you mount an RF lens, it would move forward to 20mm to be able to work with those. Two pitfalls with this, however. The first is that you've inherently then got a big DSLR body that is predominantly a lot of wasted space, because normally that space in a DSLR is taken up with the mirror box, and the whole benefit of mirrorless is you take away the mirror box, the sensor can be brought closer to the mount. And I know there's the argument of, well, I don't want a small mirrorless body, I want a big chunky body, that's why I like DSLRs, but I want the benefit of mirrorless. Fair enough. But what about the best of both worlds, which would be a mirrorless camera with the size of a DSLR, but with the flange distance of a mirrorless camera? Because you can't fill that empty space in front of the sensor with anything, because obviously it needs to remain clear for the light to travel through. But if the sensor was moved up to the 20mm flange distance, that opens up 24mm behind it for you to put something like a big heatsink, so you could have a lot more processing power without worrying about the camera overheating. But the second bigger problem, which is actually a problem across all three of these ideas, is that the RF and EF mounting plates are physically different. All lenses and lens mounts are a bayonet system, so they have particular shaped teeth that fit together perfectly in one angle and then you rotate it to lock it in place. But if you look at the cutouts for the RF and EF systems, they're different shapes. So you can't mount an EF lens straight onto the RF mounting plate. That's one of the reasons why you need the adapter. And you've also got the metal contacts which allow the camera and lens to communicate with each other. Now the EF system employs an 8-pin setup, whereas the RF has increased it to 12. So I don't see how they're going to manage to have two completely different styles of lens mounting plates on the one single lens mount. The only solution I can come up with that is to have a camera that has two distinctly different mounting plates. One to fit the EF lenses and a different plate to mount onto the RF. But obviously you've only got one sensor, so they'd have to be lined in series to each other, the EF in front of the RF. But again, this brings in a load of problems, because the internal diameter of both of those mounts, the throat size, are about the same. And obviously with the lenses mounted one behind the other, if you're going to mount an RF lens into the RF mount, it's got to be able to pass through the throat of the EF mount, and none of the RF lenses are that small. Now obviously Canon has a lot of engineers and designers that could be working on this that are far more intelligent than I am, so they may well have come up with some very fanciful solution as to how to get around this. I still think that's going to leave them with a camera that is extremely overcomplicated and over-engineered, and a price tag to go with it. And I think the problem is this whole concept of trying to keep hold of the EF mount is stemming from people who aren't willing to give it up and accept that things are going to move on. I know there's the argument that there's a lot of Canon shooters that have invested heavily in the EF lenses and they don't want to transition to the RF lenses just yet, but that's kind of the point of why they've made the adapter in the first place. And because it's a native Canon lens to a native Canon body with a native Canon adapter, it all runs pretty seamlessly. I think people just need to accept that things progress and you can't keep bringing everything from the past. I mean, let's face it, if it was like that, if people were so hell-bent on keeping hold of old mounts, the EF mount would have never have been born, because everyone would have stuck with the old FD mounts from the film cameras. But the EF mount was born from the EOS system, which was the big move to digital away from film. And now look at it now. When was the last time you saw anybody shooting with an FD lens? It's not going to be an overnight transition, but you can already see the trend that manufacturers are focusing so much more of their resources onto mirrorless bodies and mirrorless lenses because they offer that greater flexibility when it comes to designing them that DSLRs just don't offer, and as a result they're not releasing any new DSLRs. You've only got to look at the trend of Sony, who are basically several years ahead of Canon in terms of the mirrorless market. Prior to the E-mount that they have today, they had the old A-mount for DSLRs and the SLT cameras, and a lot of people bought those camera bodies and those lenses. But when Sony made the transition to full mirrorless, they didn't keep hold of the A-mount just to try and keep a few people happy, because the potential benefits from the E-mount system was so far outweighed anything that the A-mount could offer, so people gradually had to make the transition. And sure, it was a nuisance at the time, but I don't think I've seen anybody ever turn around and say, when are Sony going to make a new A-mount lens? Because barely anyone's on the system anymore. And it's going to go the same with Canon whether you like it or not. Even if they are to bring out an EF-RF hybrid camera that accepts both, they're focusing all their efforts on RF lenses. They're not going to be bringing out any new EF lenses. So eventually, might be 10 years down the line, but gradually all those current EF lenses that are in circulation are going to slowly age and break and not be replaced, and more and more people are going to start to transition to mirrorless, and people who are just joining the systems now are going to be looking at it and thinking, do I buy an aged system that's not going to be getting updated, or do I invest straight into the mirrorless systems, which is where the future's lying? So I think even if this hybrid camera does come to fruition, it's just people trying to hold on to a past that they're not quite prepared to let go of yet, but they'll have to one day. But in reality, I don't think there's going to be a true hybrid camera, not one that can mount two completely different types of lenses with no need for an additional adapter or accessory or anything like that. I just don't think it's going to be physically possible. I think it might be at best a variation of the RF adapter that just streamlines the process, but even that I don't see how it's going to happen. But what do you guys make of this rumour? Do you think it's poppycock, never going to come to anything, or do you think there's some validity to it, and if so, how do you think Canon are going to get around these particular hurdles? Leave your thoughts and comments in the box down below. While you're down there, if you haven't already, please consider hitting the subscribe button, and there is also a link to my Patreon account if you'd like to go and support the channel through there. Well, thank you so much for stopping by, and hopefully, I'll see you in the next video.